In the harsh winter of 1889, when temperatures dropped to 40 degrees below zero across the Dakota Territory, nature had a way of testing the bonds between predator and prey. What happened on that frozen February morning would challenge everything the Sioux people thought they knew about wolves. When 17-year-old Running Bear set out on what should have been a routine hunting expedition, he never imagined he would return with a story that would be passed down through generations. A story about survival, instinct, and an unlikely guardian who refused to let death claim another victim to the merciless winter. The old ones say that animals can sense things humans cannot. They speak of a world beyond what we see, where spirits guide the actions of creatures great and small. On that bitter morning when the snow fell like tiny daggers and the wind howled with the voices of ancestors, one small wolf pup would prove that sometimes the most unexpected heroes emerge from the wild places of the world. This is not just a story about survival against impossible odds. It is about the mysterious connection that exists between all living things and how sometimes, in our darkest moments, help comes from the most surprising sources. Running Bear pulled his buffalo hide cloak tighter around his shoulders as he stepped out of his family's winter lodge. The morning air hit his face like a physical blow, sharp and clean, carrying the promise of a harsh day ahead. At 17, he had been hunting for nearly 6 years, but the Dakota winters still demanded respect from even the most experienced hunters. His breath formed white clouds that disappeared quickly in the bitter air, and the snow beneath his moccasins crunched with the particular sound that only came when temperatures dropped far below freezing. His father, Grey Wolf, had been teaching him to read the signs that nature provided. The way the smoke from their fire rose straight up into the still air told him there would be no wind today, which meant the cold would settle deep into everything it touched. The absence of bird calls suggested that even the hardiest creatures had taken shelter. These were not ideal conditions for hunting, but winter was unforgiving, and their food stores were running low. The successful buffalo hunt from autumn had provided well for the tribe through the early winter months. But now, in the heart of February, careful rationing was necessary. Running Bear checked his hunting gear one final time. His bow was carved from seasoned ashwood, strong and flexible, capable of sending arrows with deadly accuracy across considerable distances. The sinew string had been kept dry and treated with bear fat to prevent it from snapping in the cold. His quiver held 12 arrows, each one carefully crafted with iron points traded from white settlers the previous summer. These points were precious, far superior to the traditional flint arrowheads his grandfather had used, and losing even one would be a significant loss for his family. His hunting knife, passed down from his grandfather's grandfather, hung at his side in a beaded sheath made by his sister. The blade was sharp enough to cut through leather with ease, and the bone handle fit perfectly in his grip. Around his waist he wore a belt pouch containing dried meat, a fire-starting kit with flint and steel, and a small medicine bundle his grandmother had prepared for protection during hunts. Every item had its purpose, and every purpose was essential for survival in the wilderness. The young hunter had planned to travel to the area near White Rock Creek, about 8 miles northwest of their winter camp. Grey Wolf had seen deer tracks there 2 days earlier, fresh enough to suggest a small herd was staying in that area, probably seeking shelter in the thick stands of cottonwood and willow that grew along the creek banks. Deer were smart enough to know that the trees provided some protection from the wind, and the creek, even partially frozen, might still offer access to water. As Running Bear left the circle of lodges that made up their winter camp, he could see smoke rising from several other fires. The camp was smaller now than it had been during the summer gatherings. Many families had split off to smaller groups for the winter, spreading out across the territory to reduce the pressure on local game populations. This was an ancient practice, one that ensured survival for everyone when resources became scarce during the harsh months. His grandmother, Singing Crow, emerged from her lodge as he passed. She was wrapped in layers of wool blankets and fur, but her eyes were sharp and alert despite her advanced age. She had lived through more than 70 winters, and her wisdom was respected throughout the tribe. She called to him softly, her voice carrying easily in the crisp air. "Running Bear, the spirits are restless today," she said, a weathered hand reaching out to touch his arm. "I dreamed of wolves last night. They were not hunting, but watching. Be careful where you step today, grandson." He nodded respectfully to her words. Dreams were important in their culture, often containing warnings or guidance that could mean the difference between life and death. His grandmother's dreams had proven true many times before. He promised her he would be careful and would return before the sun began to set. The journey to White Rock Creek would take him across varied terrain. First, he would travel through the open prairie that surrounded their camp, where the snow lay in smooth drifts shaped by the constant prairie winds. Here, he would need to watch for signs of predators. Wolves, coyotes, and the occasional mountain lion left tracks that could be read like words on a page. Fresh tracks meant potential danger, while old tracks told stories of where animals had been and where they might be going. After the prairie came a stretch of broken country, where small hills and ravines created a landscape of hidden valleys and unexpected obstacles. This was challenging. Terrain in good weather, potentially deadly in winter conditions. Snow could hide drop-offs, fallen trees, or unstable ground. A single misstep could result in a twisted ankle or broken leg, either of which would be a death sentence this far from help. As he walked, Running Bear practiced the walking technique his father had taught him for snow travel. Each step was deliberate and careful, with his weight distributed evenly to avoid breaking through snow into hidden obstacles below. He used a walking stick cut from ironwood both for balance and for testing the ground ahead of him. The stick was also useful for checking ice thickness when crossing streams or frozen ponds. The silence of the winter morning was profound in a way that only those who have experienced true wilderness can understand. There were no sounds of insects, no bird songs, no rustling of small animals in underbrush. Even his own footsteps seemed muffled by the vast expanse of snow and the absorbed sound of the winter landscape. This silence could be both comforting and unsettling. It meant that potential prey would be easier to hear when he found it, but it also meant that any sounds he made would carry much farther than usual. About an hour into his journey, Running Bear paused at the top of a small rise to scan the landscape ahead. His trained eyes searched for any movement, any disturbance in the snow that might indicate animal activity. He was looking for the subtle signs that marked the presence of deer. Tracks, droppings, browsing marks on trees where they had scraped away bark for food, or the distinctive beds they made in the snow for resting. In the distance, he could see the dark line of trees that marked White Rock Creek's path across the landscape. The cottonwoods and willows stood out starkly against the white expanse, their bare branches creating intricate patterns against the pale grey sky. This was where he hoped to find his quarry, but he also knew it was where other predators might be hunting as well. The cold was beginning to penetrate even his heavy winter clothing. Despite the buffalo hide cloak and the layers of wool and leather beneath it, the bitter air found ways to reach his skin. His fingers, protected by mittens made from rabbit fur, were starting to lose feeling. This was one of the constant dangers of winter hunting. A hunter whose hands became too cold to properly draw a bowstring or grip a knife effectively was a hunter who might not survive an encounter with dangerous prey or predators. Running Bear knew he would need to keep moving to maintain his body heat, but he also needed to move slowly enough to avoid missing signs of game. This balance between speed and caution was one of the most challenging aspects of winter hunting. Move too fast and you might walk right past your quarry or into danger. Move too slowly and the cold could sap your strength or impair your ability to react quickly when the moment for action came. As he descended toward the creek bottom, the young hunter's thoughts turned to his family waiting back at the camp. His mother, Bright Star, had been rationing their stored food carefully, but he could see the worry in her eyes when she thought no one was looking. His younger sister, Little Dove, had been complaining less about being hungry, which actually worried him more than her complaints had. When children stopped asking for food, it usually meant they were learning to accept hunger as normal. His father had been making increasingly long hunting trips, sometimes staying out for 2 or 3 days at a time in hopes of finding game. Each time Grey Wolf returned empty-handed, Running Bear could see the weight of responsibility settling more heavily on his father's shoulders. As the eldest son, Running Bear felt the pressure to contribute to his family's survival, to prove himself capable of helping to provide for those who depended on him. The responsibility was not just to his immediate family, but to the entire winter camp. In Sioux culture, successful hunters shared their kill with others in need, particularly elders and families whose primary hunters had been injured or killed. This system of mutual support had allowed their people to survive harsh conditions for countless generations, but it only worked when hunters were successful often enough to create surplus that could be shared. As Running Bear approached the creek bottom, he could see that his father's information had been accurate. The snow here showed clear signs of animal activity. Deer tracks crossed and recrossed the area, and he could see places where they had poured through the snow to reach grass underneath. Fresh droppings suggested the deer had been here recently, probably within the last day or two. But there were other tracks as well. Wolf prints, larger than those of coyotes, created a pattern that suggested a pack had passed through the area. The tracks appeared to be following the same path the deer had taken, which was not surprising. Wolves were intelligent hunters who understood that deer would seek shelter in areas like this during severe weather. More concerning was what appeared to be fresh bear tracks. Black bears usually went into hibernation during the coldest months, but occasionally one would be disturbed from its winter sleep, or might not have found adequate shelter before the worst weather arrived. A hungry bear awakened in winter was extremely dangerous, desperate for food, and often willing to attack anything that might provide a meal. Running Bear studied the tracks carefully, using skills his father and uncle had spent years teaching him. The bear tracks appeared to be heading away from the creek area, probably moving toward higher ground where caves or other shelter might be available. The tracks were at least a day old, covered by a light dusting of fresh snow that had fallen during the night. The wolf tracks were more recent, possibly from early that morning. The pack appeared to be moving in a purposeful direction rather than hunting randomly, which suggested they might be traveling to a den site or following a specific scent trail. Wolves were generally not dangerous to humans unless they were protecting pups or were desperate from hunger, but they would compete with him for any deer in the area. Despite these signs of predator activity, Running Bear decided to continue with his hunt. The deer sign was too promising to ignore, and his family's need was too great to turn back because of possible danger. However, he made mental notes of the predator tracks and planned his hunting strategy accordingly. He would need to be extra alert and ready to defend himself or retreat quickly if necessary. The creek itself was frozen solid, covered by ice thick enough to walk on safely. In some places, snow had drifted deep enough to completely hide the creek bed, creating a level surface that made travel easier, but also more dangerous because hidden obstacles lay beneath. Running Bear used his walking stick to probe ahead as he crossed, ensuring that each step would support his weight. On the far side of the creek, the deer signs became even more concentrated. Here, sheltered by the trees and protected from the worst of the prairie wind, a small herd had clearly been spending significant time. The tracks suggested at least 4 or 5 deer, including what appeared to be one large buck based on the size of the hoofprints. Running Bear found a good position among a cluster of young cottonwoods where he could observe the area while remaining hidden. The trees provided some protection from the wind, and their grey bark helped camouflage his position. From here, he could see most of the creek bottom area where the deer were likely to appear if they returned to feed. He settled in to wait, knowing that patience was often the most important quality a hunter could possess. Deer were creatures of habit, often following the same routes and visiting the same feeding areas at predictable times. If he could remain still and quiet long enough, there was a good chance they would return. Running Bear had been waiting in his concealed position for nearly 2 hours when the first signs of changing weather began to appear. What had started as a clear, bitterly cold morning was slowly transforming into something much more threatening. The pale grey sky that had seemed stable and unchanging began to darken toward the northwest, taking on the ominous color that experienced plainsmen learned to fear. At first, the changes were subtle. A slight shift in the air pressure that made his ears feel strange, a barely perceptible increase in wind speed that caused the bare branches above him to whisper softly, where before they had been completely still. The quality of light changed gradually, becoming flatter and more diffuse as clouds began to thicken overhead. Running Bear had seen enough Dakota Territory weather to recognize the signs of an approaching storm. His grandfather had taught him to read the sky, like other men read tracks in the dirt. The dark line on the northwestern horizon was moving toward him with the steady inevitability of a river flowing downhill. This was not going to be a brief snow shower that would pass quickly, leaving behind a light dusting of fresh powder. This had the look of a serious storm, the kind that could trap travelers far from shelter and claim lives with brutal efficiency. Despite his growing concern about the weather, Running Bear was reluctant to abandon his hunt. The deer signs in this area were the freshest he had seen in weeks, and his family's need for meat was becoming increasingly desperate. His mother had been making their stored food stretch by preparing smaller and smaller portions, and he had noticed that she often claimed not to be hungry so that he and his sister could eat more. This kind of sacrifice was typical of Sioux mothers, but it also meant the situation was becoming critical. Just as he was debating whether to wait a little longer or begin the journey home, movement caught his eye through the trees. 3 deer emerged from a thicket about 60 yards downstream from his position. 2 does and a young buck, moving cautiously but not frantically, suggesting they had not detected his presence. They began to feed on the exposed grass and bark that could be reached by pouring through the snow. Running Bear's heart rate increased as he slowly and carefully shifted position to get a clear shot. The nearest doe was about 50 yards away, well within range of his bow if he could draw and aim without being detected. He had practiced shooting in cold weather conditions, and he knew his equipment well enough to compensate for the effects of low temperature on the bowstring and arrow flight. The process of preparing for the shot had to be done with extraordinary care. Any sudden movement would alert the deer and send them bounding away through the trees faster than he could possibly follow. He gradually worked his hand toward his bow, moving so slowly that the motion was almost imperceptible. Each movement had to be timed with the deer's own movements, when their attention was focused on feeding rather than watching for danger. Drawing the bowstring in winter conditions presented special challenges. The cold made the sinew string less flexible, requiring more force to achieve full draw. His fingers, despite the protection of his mittens, were beginning to lose some sensitivity from the cold. He knew he would have to remove the mittens to get a proper grip on the string, which would expose his hands to the bitter air at the critical moment, when steadiness was most important. As he prepared for the shot, the wind began to pick up noticeably. What had been barely a whisper in the branches above became a low, steady moan that masked small sounds but also created movement in the vegetation that could hide or reveal his position. The deer seemed to sense the changing weather as well. They fed more quickly and kept their heads up more frequently, scanning for danger with the heightened alertness that wild animals display when storms approach. Running Bear had just managed to get his bow ready and was beginning the slow process of drawing the string when the weather situation changed dramatically. The wind suddenly increased from a gentle breeze to a strong, steady blow that sent snow swirling through the trees and made accurate shooting nearly impossible. Within minutes, what had been a cold but manageable hunting situation transformed into the beginning of a genuine blizzard. The deer immediately sensed the danger and bounded away through the trees, their white tails flashing as they disappeared into the growing storm. Running Bear watched his opportunity vanish and realized that his priorities had just shifted completely. This was no longer about hunting success or failure. This had become a matter of survival. The storm intensified with frightening speed. The wind went from strong to violent in what seemed like moments, driving snow horizontally through the air and reducing visibility to only a few yards. The temperature, already bitter, seemed to drop even further as the wind chill factor made the cold penetrate through even the best winter clothing. Running Bear knew he needed to start for home immediately, but he also realized that traveling in these conditions would be extremely dangerous. The familiar landmarks he had used to navigate to this location were already becoming obscured by the blowing snow. The tracks he had made coming here were being erased by the wind almost as quickly as they had been made. For a moment he considered trying to find shelter where he was and waiting out the storm. The cottonwoods provided some protection from the wind, and he could potentially build a shelter using dead branches and his buffalo hide cloak. But this option carried its own risks. If the storm lasted for hours or even days, he would be trapped without adequate food, water, or firewood. His family would also worry when he failed to return, and might send search parties out into the dangerous conditions. After quickly weighing his options, Running Bear decided that his best chance was to try to make it home before the storm reached its full intensity. He knew the general direction he needed to travel, and if he could maintain his orientation despite the poor visibility, he might be able to reach familiar territory before conditions became completely impossible. He packed his gear quickly and began the journey home, moving as fast as safety would allow while still being careful about his footing. The snow that had been merely deep when he arrived was now being whipped into drifts by the wind, creating unpredictable obstacles and hiding potential dangers. What had been a manageable 8-mile walk in the morning had become a life-threatening challenge. The first few miles of his return journey went better than he had expected. Despite the worsening conditions, he was able to maintain his general sense of direction by using the wind direction as a guide. The storm was coming from the northwest, so by keeping the wind at his back and slightly to his left, he could maintain a southeasterly course toward home. However, as the storm continued to intensify, even this basic navigation became difficult. The wind shifted directions frequently, sometimes swirling in ways that made it impossible to use as a reliable compass. Snow was now falling so heavily that it created an almost complete whiteout, reducing visibility to just a few feet in any direction. Running Bear's physical condition began to deteriorate as well. The cold was penetrating his clothing despite all his preparations, and the constant effort of walking through deepening snow was exhausting his energy reserves. His hands and feet were losing feeling, which made it difficult to maintain his grip on his walking stick, and dangerous in terms of frostbite development. About halfway through his planned route home, Running Bear realized he was becoming disoriented. The landscape that had been familiar in the morning was now completely obscured by the storm. Every direction looked the same. A wall of white driving snow that revealed nothing of the terrain, beyond a few feet away. He stopped and tried to get his bearings, but the effort proved futile. Without visible landmarks, and with the wind direction constantly changing, he had no reliable way to determine which direction would lead him home. The realization that he was lost in a blizzard sent a chill through him that had nothing to do with the physical cold. This was the nightmare scenario that every plains hunter feared. Stories were told around winter fires about men who had become lost in storms like this, found days or weeks later frozen solid just miles from safety. Some were never found at all, their remains discovered only when the spring thaw revealed what the winter had claimed. Running Bear forced himself to think clearly, despite the growing panic he felt. Panic was more dangerous than the storm itself, because it led to poor decisions that could turn a difficult situation into a fatal one. His father and grandfather had taught him that survival often depended more on mental discipline than on physical tools or abilities. He decided to look for some kind of natural shelter, where he could wait out the worst of the storm. Even if he couldn't continue traveling safely, he might be able to survive if he could find protection from the wind and driving snow. Trees, rock formations, or even natural depressions in the ground might provide enough shelter to keep him alive until conditions improved. Through the swirling snow, he caught glimpses of what appeared to be a line of trees ahead. Moving toward them carefully, he discovered a small grove of cottonwoods growing in a natural depression that provided some protection from the wind. It wasn't ideal shelter, but it was better than being exposed on open ground. As he worked his way into the grove, Running Bear stepped on what he thought was solid ground covered by snow. Instead, his foot broke through into a hidden creek bed that was deeper than expected. The sudden drop caught him off balance, and he fell hard onto the rocks below, his left leg twisting painfully beneath him. The pain that shot through his ankle and lower leg was immediate and intense. When he tried to put weight on the leg to stand up, it buckled beneath him, sending him sprawling again on the frozen rocks. Through the pain and shock, Running Bear realized that his situation had just become much worse. He was lost in a blizzard with what appeared to be a serious injury to his leg. Lying in the creek bed with snow swirling around him, Running Bear felt the first real touch of despair since the storm had begun. The cold was already penetrating his body more quickly now that he wasn't moving to generate heat. The injured leg meant he wouldn't be able to travel even if the storm cleared enough to allow navigation. As he struggled to assess his injuries and figure out what to do next, Running Bear heard something that made him freeze with a different kind of fear. Through the howling of the wind, he could hear another sound, the long, haunting call of a wolf. Somewhere nearby in the storm, the wolf's howl seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once, distorted by the wind and muffled by the falling snow. Running Bear lay motionless in the creek bed, his injured leg throbbing with each heartbeat, trying to determine where the sound had originated and whether it signaled immediate danger. In his current condition, unable to run and with limited mobility, an encounter with a wolf pack could be fatal. The howl came again, closer this time, and Running Bear could tell it was the call of a single wolf rather than the complex harmonies of a pack. This was both encouraging and puzzling. Wolves rarely traveled alone, especially during winter, when hunting large prey required cooperation. A lone wolf might be less dangerous than a pack, but it might also be more desperate, driven to take risks that a well-fed pack member would avoid. Through the swirling snow, Running Bear caught a glimpse of movement among the trees above the creek bed. A grey shape moved through the storm, barely visible through the white curtain that surrounded him. The figure was too large to be a coyote, but seemed smaller than the full-grown wolves he had encountered before. As it moved closer, he realized he was looking at a young wolf, probably born the previous spring, and now facing its first winter as an independent hunter. The wolf pup appeared to be following his scent trail, moving with the careful, deliberate steps of an animal trying to understand what it had discovered. It showed no signs of the aggressive posture that would indicate an immediate attack. Instead, it seemed curious, perhaps even cautious, as it approached the creek bed where Running Bear lay injured. When the young wolf reached the edge of the creek bed, it stopped and looked down at him. Running Bear found himself staring into amber eyes that seemed far too intelligent for an animal he had been taught to fear. The wolf's head tilted slightly to one side, as if it were trying to understand what it was seeing. Here was a human, clearly injured and vulnerable, lying helpless in a storm that was dangerous even for creatures adapted to winter survival. For several long moments, predator and potential prey regarded each other through the falling snow. Running Bear's hand moved slowly toward the knife at his belt, but something in the wolf's posture stopped him from drawing the weapon. The young animal showed no signs of aggression. Its ears were forward in an alert but not threatening position, and its tail, while not wagging like a domestic dog's might, was not held in the high, stiff position that would indicate hostile intent. The wolf seemed to be making some kind of decision. It moved along the edge of the creek bed, always keeping Running Bear in sight, until it found a place where the bank was low enough to allow it to descend. With careful, measured steps, it made its way down into the creek bed, stopping about 10 feet away from where the injured hunter lay. Up close, Running Bear could see that this was indeed a young animal, probably less than a year old. Its winter coat was thick and healthy, suggesting it had been successful in finding food despite its apparent separation from its pack. The pup was lean but not emaciated, alert but not frantic with hunger. This was encouraging, as a starving wolf would be much more likely to view him as a potential meal. What happened next surprised Running Bear completely. Instead of approaching closer or moving away, the young wolf lay down in the snow, positioning itself where it could watch both the injured human and the surrounding area. It seemed to be settling in for an extended stay, as if it had decided to keep watch over this strange situation it had discovered. The storm continued to rage around them, but the creek bed provided some shelter from the worst of the wind. Snow accumulated steadily, and Running Bear realized that if the storm continued much longer, they would both be in serious danger of being buried. The cold was already penetrating his body, and despite his winter clothing, he could feel hypothermia beginning to affect his thinking and coordination. As if sensing his deteriorating condition, the wolf stood up and moved closer. Running Bear tensed, unsure what to expect, but the animal's movements remained non-threatening. The wolf circled him once, as if assessing the situation, then lay down again, this time close enough that Running Bear could feel the warmth radiating from its body. The warmth was more than just physical comfort. In the deadly cold of the blizzard, the wolf's body heat could mean the difference between survival and freezing to death. Running Bear realized that the animal had somehow understood his desperate situation and was offering the only help it could provide, sharing its warmth to keep him alive. This behavior went against everything Running Bear had been taught about wolves. They were supposed to be savage predators, interested only in their next meal, and hostile to all other creatures except their own pack members. Yet here was a young wolf, vulnerable itself in the harsh conditions, choosing to stay with an injured human and share its body heat. As the hours passed and the storm raged on, an extraordinary partnership developed in that creek bed. The wolf remained alert, frequently raising its head to scan the surrounding area for signs of danger. Occasionally it would stand and shake the accumulated snow from its fur, then settle back down close to Running Bear, always positioning itself to provide maximum warmth while maintaining a clear view of potential escape routes. Running Bear tried several times to assess the damage to his leg, but movement was difficult and painful. The ankle appeared to be either severely sprained or possibly broken. The lower leg was swollen and tender, and any attempt to put weight on it caused intense pain. He was effectively immobilized, completely dependent on shelter and warmth to survive until the storm passed. The young wolf seemed to understand the severity of the situation better than might be expected from such a young animal. When Running Bear's breathing became shallow and rapid, early signs of hypothermia, the wolf moved even closer, pressing its warm body against the human's side. When Running Bear's eyes began to droop closed, a dangerous sign in freezing conditions, the wolf would nudge him gently with its nose, as if encouraging him to stay awake. This behavior was particularly remarkable because falling asleep in extreme cold is often fatal. The wolf pup seemed to instinctively understand that keeping Running Bear conscious was essential for his survival. Every time the injured hunter showed signs of losing consciousness, the wolf would find a way to rouse him, sometimes by gentle contact, sometimes by shifting position in a way that required Running Bear to adjust his own position to maintain contact with the life-saving warmth. As night began to fall, though the storm made it difficult to distinguish day from night, the temperature dropped even further. Running Bear's condition deteriorated despite the wolf's efforts. His speech became slurred when he tried to talk to the animal, and his movements became increasingly uncoordinated. These were clear signs that hypothermia was advancing, and without immediate help, he would not survive much longer. The wolf pup seemed to recognize the increasing urgency of the situation. It began to behave in ways that showed remarkable intelligence and problem-solving ability. The animal would leave Running Bear's side for short periods, always returning quickly, but each time bringing something that could help: dead branches that could provide some additional shelter from the wind, dried grass that could serve as insulation, even what appeared to be deliberately chosen stones that could help reflect heat. During one of these brief absences, Running Bear heard the wolf howling again, but this time the call seemed different. Instead of the lonely sound he had heard earlier, this was a more complex vocalization, almost as if the animal were trying to communicate with something or someone in the distance. The howl was repeated several times, with pauses between each call, as if the wolf were listening for a response. Running Bear's condition made it difficult for him to think clearly, but some part of his mind registered that the wolf's behavior had changed significantly. The animal was no longer simply providing warmth and companionship, it was actively working to solve the problem of how to keep him alive, and it seemed to be calling for help. Through the haze of cold and pain, Running Bear began to understand that he was witnessing something extraordinary. This was not just a case of an animal acting on instinct or even basic compassion. The wolf pup was demonstrating a level of intelligence and empathy that challenged fundamental assumptions about the relationship between humans and wild animals. As the night wore on, the wolf's vigil continued. The animal remained alert and active, constantly adjusting its position to provide maximum warmth, regularly checking on Running Bear's condition, and periodically calling out into the storm with those complex vocalizations that seemed to carry meaning beyond simple communication. The storm began to show signs of weakening as the wind became less violent and the snow fell less heavily. But Running Bear's condition had deteriorated to the point where he was drifting in and out of consciousness despite the wolf's efforts to keep him awake. His body temperature had dropped dangerously low, and he was approaching the point where survival would depend on factors beyond even the wolf's remarkable care. It was during one of his periods of semi-consciousness that Running Bear became aware of new sounds in the distance. Through the diminishing storm, he could hear what sounded like human voices, still far away but growing closer. The wolf heard them too, and began to call out more frequently and urgently, as if trying to guide the voices toward their location in the creek bed. The voices in the distance grew gradually clearer as the storm continued to weaken. Through the fog of hypothermia and exhaustion, Running Bear began to recognize familiar sounds, his father's voice calling his name, and the deeper tones of his uncle, Strong Bull, shouting directions to other searchers. The wolf pup heard them too, and its response was immediate and purposeful. The young animal stood up and began to howl with renewed urgency. No longer the tentative calls it had been making throughout the night, but powerful, carrying vocalizations that cut through the diminishing wind like a beacon. Between each howl, the wolf would pause and listen, tilting its head toward the sounds of the approaching rescue party, then adjust the direction of its next call to guide them more accurately. Grey Wolf had noticed his son's absence when the storm first struck. As an experienced hunter and father, he knew that Running Bear should have turned back at the first signs of serious weather. When the young man failed to return by nightfall, despite the dangerous conditions, Grey Wolf had organized a search party consisting of himself, Strong Bull, and 2 other experienced trackers from their winter camp. The searchers had waited until the worst of the storm passed before venturing out, knowing that searching during the height of the blizzard would likely result in more casualties. But as soon as conditions improved enough to allow travel, they had set out following the general direction Running Bear had taken that morning, hoping to find either the young hunter himself or at least some trace of his route. The search had been difficult and frustrating. The storm had erased most tracks and obscured familiar landmarks. The searchers had been working largely on intuition and experience, checking likely shelter spots and trying to think like a lost hunter would think. They had been calling out regularly, hoping their voices might carry to wherever Running Bear might be taking shelter. When they first heard the wolf's howls, the searchers had mixed reactions. Wolves could be dangerous to search parties, especially if they were protecting a kill or had become desperate from hunger. But Strong Bull, who had extensive experience reading animal behavior, noticed something unusual about these particular calls. The howls seemed deliberate and directional, almost as if the animal were trying to communicate with them rather than warn them away. Grey Wolf made the decision to investigate the source of the wolf calls, reasoning that if his son were injured or trapped, he might be in the same area that had attracted the wolf's attention. The searchers moved carefully toward the sound, weapons ready but not immediately threatening, calling out as they approached so that Running Bear would know help was coming if he were conscious and able to hear them. As the search party drew closer to the creek bed, the wolf's behavior became even more remarkable. Instead of fleeing when it detected the approaching humans, the animal intensified its calls and began to move back and forth along the edge of the creek bed, clearly visible against the snow, almost as if it were deliberately making itself seen to guide the rescuers to the exact location. When Grey Wolf first caught sight of his son lying in the creek bed with a wolf positioned protectively nearby, his initial instinct was to raise his weapon and drive the predator away, but something in the scene made him pause. The wolf was not behaving aggressively or possessively. Instead, it seemed to be standing guard over the injured human, and when it saw the approaching rescuers, it stepped back but did not flee entirely. Strong Bull approached the edge of the creek bed cautiously, speaking in low, calm tones to avoid startling either his nephew or the wolf. What he saw below challenged everything he thought he understood about wild animal behavior. Running Bear was clearly alive but in serious condition, and it was obvious that he had been lying in this exposed position for many hours. In the deadly cold of the previous night, survival would have been impossible without some form of protection from the elements. The evidence of the wolf's protective vigil was unmistakable. The snow around Running Bear had been repeatedly disturbed where the animal had moved to maintain close contact. There were clear signs that the wolf had brought materials to the location: branches, dried grass, and other debris that could provide insulation and shelter. Most remarkably, the pattern of snow accumulation showed that the wolf had positioned itself to shield the human from the worst effects of the wind and weather. As the rescuers prepared to descend into the creek bed, the wolf pup finally retreated, but only a short distance. It moved to a position where it could watch the rescue operation while remaining ready to flee if threatened. Throughout the process of getting Running Bear to safety, the animal maintained its vigil, as if ensuring that the transfer of responsibility from wolf to human was completed successfully. Running Bear was conscious but barely coherent when his father reached him. His speech was slurred from hypothermia, and his movements were weak and uncoordinated. But he was alive, and his core body temperature, while dangerously low, was not at the fatal level it would have reached without the wolf's protection. The first thing he tried to tell his rescuers was about the wolf, struggling through his confused mental state to make them understand that the animal had saved his life. Grey Wolf quickly assessed his son's condition and realized that they needed to get him to warmth and shelter immediately. The injured leg was clearly serious, but the hypothermia was the more immediate threat. They wrapped Running Bear in additional furs and blankets that they had brought for the rescue, and prepared to transport him back to camp as quickly as safety would allow. As they lifted Running Bear from the creek bed, he kept looking back toward where the wolf pup waited, still watching from its safe distance. Despite his confused mental state, he seemed to understand that he was leaving behind the creature that had kept him alive through the most dangerous night of his life. The separation was difficult, made more poignant by the wolf's obvious reluctance to see its charge taken away. The journey back to camp was challenging but successful. The searchers had prepared a travois, a traditional sledge that could be pulled across snow specifically for transporting an injured person. Running Bear drifted in and out of consciousness during the trip, but his condition gradually stabilized as his body began to warm up and his circulation improved. Back at the winter camp, the women had prepared for the possibility of treating severe cold exposure and injuries. Singing Crow, Running Bear's grandmother, took charge of his care with the authority that came from decades of experience dealing with the harsh realities of plains life. She immediately began the careful process of gradually warming his body while treating the injured leg and checking for frostbite damage. The wolf pup had followed the rescue party at a distance, staying far enough away to avoid conflict, but close enough to keep the group in sight. Several of the searchers noticed the animal's behavior and remarked on how unusual it was for a wolf to show such persistent interest in human activity without apparent hostile intent. As word of the rescue spread through the camp, people began to gather to hear the story of what had happened. Running Bear, as his condition improved and his mind cleared, was able to provide a more complete account of his extraordinary night in the storm. His description of the wolf's behavior created amazement and discussion among the tribal elders, many of whom had never heard of such a thing happening between a human and a wild wolf. Strong Bull, who had the most experience with animal behavior among the searchers, confirmed the evidence they had seen at the rescue site. The wolf had clearly spent the entire night protecting Running Bear from the storm, providing warmth, bringing materials for shelter, and finally calling for help when rescue was needed. This was not simple animal curiosity or even basic compassion, but intelligent, purposeful behavior aimed at preserving human life. Singing Crow listened to the account with particular interest. As one of the keepers of tribal traditions and stories, she understood the significance of what had occurred. In the spiritual beliefs of their people, animals were not merely creatures to be hunted or feared, but were connected to humans through the great web of life that encompassed all living things. What Running Bear had experienced was evidence of this connection manifesting in a time of desperate need. The story of the wolf's vigil spread quickly through the winter camp and beyond, carried by visitors and traders to other tribal groups across the region. It became one of those rare accounts that challenged people to reconsider their assumptions about the natural world and their place in it. Here was concrete evidence that the relationship between humans and wild animals could be far more complex and meaningful than most people believed. As Running Bear recovered over the following days, he found himself changed by the experience. The injury to his leg would heal, though it would leave him with a permanent limp. But the psychological and spiritual impact of his encounter with the wolf would influence him for the rest of his life. He had looked into the eyes of a wild predator and seen not an enemy, but a fellow creature willing to risk its own survival to help another in need. The wolf pup, meanwhile, had returned to the area around the creek bed where the rescue had taken place. Hunters and travelers who passed through the region in the days following the storm reported seeing a young wolf that showed no fear of humans, almost as if it were looking for something or someone it had lost. 3 weeks after the rescue, Running Bear had recovered enough to walk short distances with the help of a walking stick his father had carved for him. The injury to his leg was healing, though it was clear he would always have a slight limp as a reminder of that night in the storm. More significant than his physical recovery was the change that had taken place in his understanding of the world around him. The story of his encounter with the wolf pup had spread throughout the winter camp and beyond, carried by visitors to neighboring tribes and trading posts across the Dakota Territory. Each telling of the story seemed to add new layers of meaning and interpretation, but the core facts remained constant. A young wolf had chosen to protect a human stranger, risking its own survival to keep him alive through a deadly storm. Singing Crow had been particularly affected by her grandson's account. As one of the tribal elders responsible for preserving and interpreting traditional stories, she recognized the spiritual significance of what had occurred. In the belief system of their people, such events were not random coincidences, but meaningful connections that revealed deeper truths about the relationship between all living creatures. During his recovery, Running Bear had spent many hours talking with his grandmother about the meaning of his experience. She helped him understand that what had happened was part of a larger spiritual reality that connected all life on the plains. The wolf had acted not just from animal instinct, but from a deeper wisdom that recognized the sacred nature of all existence. As word of the story spread, it began to attract the attention of people beyond the immediate tribal community. Traders, missionaries, and government officials who heard the account reacted with varying degrees of skepticism and interest. Some dismissed it as an exaggerated tale of survival, while others recognized it as evidence of animal intelligence and empathy that challenged conventional understanding. A traveling journalist named Thomas Morrison, who was documenting life in the Dakota Territory for Eastern newspapers, heard the story from a trader at Fort Pierre and decided to investigate for himself. Morrison traveled to the winter camp specifically to interview Running Bear and the other witnesses to gather a complete account of the incident. Morrison's initial skepticism dissolved when he spoke with Grey Wolf and Strong Bull, both of whom provided detailed descriptions of the evidence they had seen at the rescue site. The physical signs of the wolf's protective behavior were unmistakable to experienced trackers, and their accounts corroborated every aspect of Running Bear's story. The journalist also interviewed other tribal members who confirmed the character and reliability of everyone involved in the incident. The article Morrison eventually published in the Chicago Tribune brought national attention to the story of the wolf pup and the Sioux hunter. The account appeared in newspapers across the country, generating widespread discussion about animal intelligence and the relationship between humans and wildlife. For many readers in eastern cities, this was their first exposure to a story that portrayed wolves as something other than dangerous predators to be eliminated. The publicity surrounding the story had unexpected consequences for Running Bear and his family. Scientists and naturalists from universities began corresponding with tribal leaders, seeking more information about the incident and asking permission to study wolf behavior in the region. Some offered payment for guided expeditions to observe wolves in their natural habitat, seeing economic opportunity in the growing scientific interest. But for Running Bear himself, the most important consequence of his experience was not the attention it brought from the outside world, but the change it had created in his own relationship with the natural environment. He found that his approach to hunting had been fundamentally altered by his encounter with the wolf pup. He could no longer see wildlife simply as prey to be pursued, but as fellow inhabitants of the world, each with their own intelligence and purpose. This change in perspective led Running Bear to develop new skills as a tracker and observer of animal behavior. Instead of focusing solely on hunting for food, he began spending time simply watching and learning from the creatures he encountered. His detailed observations of wolf pack behavior, deer migration patterns, and seasonal changes in wildlife populations became valuable knowledge that he shared with other hunters and tribal members. The wolf pup that had saved his life was seen several more times in the weeks following the rescue, always in the general area of the creek bed where the incident had occurred. Travelers reported encounters with a young wolf that showed no fear of humans and seemed almost curious about their presence. Some claimed the animal would follow them for short distances, as if seeking something familiar. Running Bear made several trips back to the creek bed, hoping to encounter his unlikely savior again, but the wolf seemed to have disappeared from the area. Tracks suggested it had finally rejoined a pack, or had moved on to establish its own territory elsewhere. The absence saddened Running Bear, who felt a profound connection to the animal that had shared its warmth during the longest night of his life. Spring arrived early that year, bringing with it the annual cycle of renewal and change that marked the end of winter's grip on the plains. As the snow melted and the first green shoots appeared, Running Bear reflected on how the experience had changed not just his own life, but the way his entire community thought about their relationship with the natural world. The story of the Wolf's Vigil had become part of tribal oral history, one of those accounts that would be told and retold for generations. But more than just an entertaining tale, it had become a teaching story that illustrated important truths about compassion, survival, and the interconnectedness of all life. Children who heard the story learned that courage and kindness could come from unexpected sources, and that the natural world was full of mysteries that challenged simple categories of friend and enemy. Singing Crow incorporated the story into the traditional teachings she passed on to young people in the tribe. She used Running Bear's experience to illustrate the importance of remaining open to wisdom that might come from any source, even from creatures that were traditionally viewed as dangerous or hostile. The wolf's behavior demonstrated that survival often depended on cooperation and mutual aid, rather than competition and dominance. As years passed, Running Bear became known not just as the man who was saved by a wolf, but as someone who had learned to see the world through different eyes. His knowledge of animal behavior and his ability to read the subtle signs of nature made him a valuable guide for hunting parties and a respected teacher of younger hunters. But he always insisted that his real education had begun during those hours in the creek bed, when a young wolf had taught him lessons that no human instructor could have provided. The story took on additional meaning as the relationship between white settlers and Native American tribes became increasingly strained. For some, Running Bear's account served as evidence that there were alternatives to the endless cycle of conflict and competition that seemed to define interactions between different peoples. If a wolf could choose compassion over predation, perhaps humans could learn similar lessons about coexistence and mutual support. Government officials and military leaders who heard the story often missed its deeper implications, focusing instead on its value as an example of the harsh conditions that made settlement of the territory challenging. But missionaries and educators recognized its potential as a teaching tool that could bridge cultural differences and promote understanding between communities that had little contact with each other. Running Bear eventually married and had children of his own, and the story of his encounter with the wolf became a family legacy passed down through generations. His children and grandchildren grew up understanding that their ancestor had experienced something extraordinary that had changed not just his own life, but had contributed to a broader shift in how people thought about their place in the natural world. The creek bed where the rescue had taken place became a landmark of sorts, visited by tribal members and curious outsiders who wanted to see the location where such an remarkable event had occurred. Some visitors reported feeling a sense of presence there, as if the spirit of cooperation and mutual aid that had been demonstrated during the storm had somehow become part of the landscape itself. In the decades that followed, as the American frontier was settled and the traditional way of life on the Great Plains was forever changed, the story of Running Bear and the wolf pup endured as a reminder of a different kind of relationship with the natural world. It stood as evidence that even in the harshest conditions, life had the capacity to surprise with demonstrations of unexpected compassion and wisdom. The tale eventually found its way into collections of frontier stories and accounts of unusual animal behavior, but for the descendants of those who had lived through the original events, it remained much more than just an interesting anecdote. It was a testament to the possibility that understanding and cooperation could emerge between the most unlikely partners, when survival and compassion became more important than fear and prejudice. Today, more than a century after that bitter February morning, when a young Sioux hunter set out to find game for his hungry family, the story of his encounter with the wolf pup continues to resonate with people who seek to understand the complex relationships that exist between humans and the natural world. It stands as a reminder that in our most vulnerable moments, help can come from the most unexpected sources, and that the capacity for compassion and self-sacrifice extends far beyond the boundaries of our own species. The legacy of that night in the storm lives on in the recognition that survival often depends not on dominance over nature, but on understanding our place within the larger community of life that includes all creatures. Running Bear's experience demonstrated that wisdom can come from any source. Courage can be found in the smallest acts of kindness, and that sometimes the greatest teachers are those we might otherwise fear or dismiss. In a world where the relationship between humans and wildlife continues to evolve, the story of the wolf pup that guarded a frozen Sioux hunter offers hope that coexistence and mutual respect remain possible. It reminds us that beneath the surface differences that seem to separate species, there exists a deeper connection that can manifest in moments of crisis as profound acts of interspecies compassion and care.